This is Crime in the Media. We're in session 10, and in this session we'll be discussing Jewkes chapter 6. In this chapter, Jewkes discusses the portrayal of police, offenders, and victims in mainly reality TV programs. She focuses on a British program called Crime Watch. But I think we can also make applications to her concepts to both regular news accounts in the news media, and then also in films and sometimes novels and books and movies, other types of media genres. Basically, I think that this chapter provides a basic recap of some of the concepts we've talked about earlier. It's just applying some of those concepts to specific images of police, offenders, and victims in the media. It begins with something that we talked about earlier, the media and its impact on the fear of crime. Now, we looked at Gerbner's idea of the fear of crime and the Mead-World syndrome. I think Jewkes makes a really interesting point in that there are other influences to fear of crime in addition to media, and some of those include real-world experiences or lived experiences, such as experiences of victimization, the risk of victimization, an environment such as a neighborhood, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, whether one is impoverished or not, and then prior contact with police can all influence one's expectation of being a victim of crime. I used to work at a church in a neighborhood in Boston called Roxbury. It was a relatively crime-ridden neighborhood. There was a lot of gang and drug activity. There were a lot of abandoned houses. It was very stereotypically a broken windows type of neighborhood. And at church one Sunday, one of the older women came in and she said, there was very casually, she said, there was a shoot up at the convenience store and I had to fall on top of my grandson to make sure he didn't get shot. And it was I was struck by how again, casually she talked about the account. So that experience in that environment, that experience of actual risk, that experience of actual victimization, can influence a fear of crime, and that shouldn't be ignored. This is the point that the left realists make, Jock Young and others, and Jewkes discusses this at length in the book. However, the fact of the matter is, most of us statistically are more likely to experience crime through the media vicariously than we are in real life. Now, we might experience some types of crime, robbery, theft, maybe even a burglary or other types of petty crime. But for the most part, statistically, we're unlikely to experience violent crime. Now, that's not to say it doesn't occur, and again, I'm not trying to diminish anyone's real experience, but statistically, the majority of the population doesn't experience crime in real life. We experience vicariously through the media. The media can function in several ways. First of all, it can function as an educator to the public of what crime is. We've talked about this before. An interesting piece that's come up recently in the media or in the news was that Ben Affleck's movie The Town inspired a string of burglaries, or at least a method to cover up their fingerprints and identification in a string of robberies of convenience stores. The offenders threw bleach on the crime scene and scattered bleach all over the crime scene in order to destroy evidence. They admitted to police that they learned this from the movie. Now, my point in bringing this up is not only does the media potentially educate offenders, but it also educates viewers as to who might be a victim of crime, who are likely victims of crime, how crimes might occur, and who we might expect to be a criminal. So the media educates the public as well as potential offenders or potential victims as to what we might expect in real life. Rafter, I actually think this chapter is a great lead-in to our discussion of Rafter in the next section. We're going to move on from news media to films with the Rafter book. and Rafter makes the point that the media provides us with a toolbox, basically, and we pack it and unpack it. We can pack it with our own ideas and perceptions of the world, and then we unpack it. And the media provides some of the tools in that toolbox that we use to consider real life and our expectations of what real life might occur. In real life might occur, particularly in terms of crime. That again, it reflects our attitudes towards crime and it helps create our attitudes towards crime. But she says it provides us tools to work with as we interpret the world around us. So what's its impact? It represents our social attitudes. It reinforces those attitudes we already hold. It can reinterpret those attitudes for us, maybe reframe them in a way that we've not thought about before. Not that it might necessarily completely change our minds, but it might rework our ideas in a particular way. It creates particular impressions of events, of people, of social groups. And again, it contributes to our experiences of crime, either virtual or real. It can reinforce the fear that was experienced in a real crime. It can also create fear as we might anticipate crimes when we see them virtually through the media. Okay, she focuses a lot of this chapter on a TV show called Crime Watch. Now, I want you to get over the fact that Crime Watch isn't a show that we're familiar with in the U.S. and realize that we still watch shows like Crime Watch all the time. Basically, it's a British version, similar to Cops, similar to America's Most Wanted, but it's most like those programs. I'm thinking of particular programs on A&E, particular programs on some of the crime channels that might be. I have to admit, I don't really watch these types of shows. Some of you may, but I know Biography focuses some of their episodes on types of crime. But they're most like those programs in the U.S. that focus on one case for an hour. They provide interviews about the case. They usually conclude in the solution of that case or the resolution of that case. And you'll see a lot of reenactment of what went on in that case during the story. So actors portraying the victims, portraying the offenders, are often highlighted in these films. It's interesting that I've seen a few of them. I used to watch them more frequently than I do now. But those reenactments don't typically contain the police. They tend to focus on the offender and the victim in those reenactments. So maybe you all can email me names of programs in the U.S. that are like Crime Watch. Again, our versions would be some of those A&E programs, Cops, America's Most Wanted. In this, she takes apart Crime Watch, and basically she's doing an analysis of Crime Watch and how Crime Watch represents particular groups of people. So she's focusing on one genre of TV program, the crime reality show or the real crime show, and how it portrays victims, offenders, and police. So she's doing basically film analysis, or in this case, I don't want to call it reality TV. It's not quite reality TV, but true crime story as a genre of news television. Okay, we'll start off with the construction of the victim. Basically, again, she makes the point that crimes that are the least common are the most covered. You've probably heard this very frequently in your criminology classes or any classes that cover statistics of crime. Violent crimes are much less likely to occur than property crimes, but we don't have TV shows that really focus on property crime. That's not something that is considered. I mean, if you can imagine petty theft, 360 or something like that. I mean, it's kind of absurd to think that would draw an audience or even be worth the production value. Crimes that are violent, crimes that are seriously violent, serial crimes, those are the types, stranger crimes, those are the types of crimes that are most covered in news media and television and fiction, television fiction. She argues that there are specific narrative techniques, and we've talked about this earlier, that are used to create the victim. There are specific ways in which a victim is, a story is constructed around the victim and those who are impacted by the crime. Maybe not the victim of the homicide, but the victim's family of the homicide. So there's a constructed story or a particular way in which a story is told that has particular production techniques. Some of those techniques are triangulation. Basically, she argues that a triangulation situates the newscaster or the television host. She calls it the presenter in the book. We don't typically use that word here, but the newscaster alongside the victim or the victim's representative, and those become the storytellers. If the victim's not available, if the victim has been murdered, the victim is not available for interview, obviously. So we'll see copious photographs of the victim. We'll see a lot of interviewed people who are victims of that homicide, relatives, friends, family. But there's a way in which the victim, relatives, or those who are impacted by that crime and that victimization, and the TV host are triangulated, and their perspectives become dominant in that particular broadcast. She says another technique is the use of families and family structures. The victims are often situated within a normative family, or at least the portrayal is that of a normative family, a family that's caring, a family that loves each other. Even if the victim might have a troubled past, that tends to be glossed over, and there tends to be a focus on love and care within that family and how much someone is missed by the family members. There tends to be use of intimate visual representations. This was really true in the Caylee Anthony murder. Any instance that a child is victimized, we see a lot of images of the victims, a lot of images of the child, even video of birthdays, of weddings. All of these visual cues allow us to personalize and empathize with the victim. They allow us to relate to the victim and to the celebrations that we all participate in. This is anybody's ordinary life, is the lesson that we learn from these use of visual representations. And there tends to be an assumption of innocence when someone is victimized or when these shows portray a victim. Now we know that in actuality, again, I'm not trying to use a blame the victim, but we know that victimization and criminal activity are correlated. We also know that that means that they're related to one another. People who participate in crime are more likely to become victims than your average person on the street that's not criminally engaged. We also know that men, young men in particular, are more likely to become victims of crime than either women or children. So our perceptions of the victim are produced that are often contrary. Our ideas of who a victim is are often contrary to who they are in real life, and this assumption of innocence is often played out pretty substantially in the coverage of instances of victimization on the television. Okay, she says they use reenactment, and the use of reenactment serves two purposes. First of all, it provides it allows us again to empathize with the victim. If someone broke into our home, I'm imagining, I think I saw one of these shows one time where you saw the hooded figure walking through the home. The fear that evokes allows us to empathize with the potential victims of that crime. She argues too, though, that in these reenactments, female victims continue to be sexualized. And if we think back on the last chapter about how women are depicted as objects to be used for entertainment purpose. She says that this objectification continues to create the idea that their victimization is to be expected, that women who are beautiful, women who are sexual, women who are sexualized are likely and in some ways contribute to their victimization. I'm not sure that this is absolutely accurate. I mean, yes, does the sexualization of women, even in these reenactments, objectify them? Yes. Can it imply that their victimization was expected? That I tend to disagree with Jewkes about for a couple of reasons. One, I think that the beautiful victim in the reenactment tends to evoke more sympathy from viewers. Again, we talked about this earlier, that our perceptions of what a normative woman are tend to reinforce our ideas of what's valuable in society. So this idea of a normative victim, the pretty, vulnerable girl, solicits more sympathy from viewers. It also reflects our social attitudes towards beauty. Oftentimes, victims on television shows and even real-life television shows, you'll see the victim interviewed and then you'll see them in the reenactment, and they look quite different. I think this reflects our social attitudes towards beauty, again, who's valued in society, who we can most empathize with in terms of their victimization, and it creates this idea that there is such thing as a normal victim. And anyone else outside of this realm of the normal victim, in some ways, deserves their victimization, or we should be suspect that they were truly victimized. So, yes, I believe the sexualization of women in these shows contributes to their objectification, but I also think that the larger harm that occurs is actually that we tend to diminish the idea that people who don't fit that role, who cannot be sexualized in the same way, are not quite victims like the normative victim might be. Okay, we'll shift now to talk about the representation of offenders. Again, she makes the point that minorities are overrepresented as offenders in many of these shows. In cops, particularly, this is true. Many of those offenders are African American, Hispanic, or at least very impoverished white in that particular show. Their victimization is also underrepresented. We know that minorities are more likely to be victims of crime, and that victimization tends to be race on race rather than cross-racial crime. This is not necessarily the way we see crime on TV. Crime on TV is much more likely to be cross-racial or interracial crime than intraracial crime. We know that crime is more likely to occur white on white crime, black on black crime, Hispanic on Hispanic crime. So not only are minorities more likely to be underrepresented as victims, which is contrary to reality, we also see interracial crime overrepresented in media accounts of crime as well. She argues that offenders are also presented as binary opposites of the victim. I like to consider them kind of the despised other, that there is again this idea that an offender is everything that we cannot be. Offenders are absolutely opposite to what we are. Normally they're presented as having a dysfunctional family. If the victim has a normative family, the offender has a dysfunctional family. If the victim is engaged in positive relationships, the offender is isolated. If the victim is emotionally stable, going about living a good life, trying to make a success for themselves, then the offender is troubled, deviant, had a difficult life, many signs of the inability to succeed in the real world. So we see that there are, again, this binary opposition between victim and offender in media accounts of both victims and offenders. I've given you in your discussion an exercise to go to Take the Lollipop. I think it's a really great example of this in particular, or the offender of a despised other. I'll let you work that out in the discussion, but it's an interesting video, and I think it fits this idea of how offenders are represented very well. Okay, this again is just an illustration of kind of the binary opposition. The offender is faceless, depersonalized, seemingly isolated, preying on unknown people. The victim, basically I did a search on internet stalkers and internet stalking victims, and these are some photos that came up through a Google image search. This is from the two girls is from a college educational website. Again, the victims seem surprised. They're socially engaged with each other in addition to being engaged on the internet. They're female. They're young. Again, this idea that there's a normative victim comes through in this. But I think the point here in terms of the representation of offenders is that we see isolation and depersonalization versus the fact that we see the faces, the personalities, and the fact that they're socially engaged in the other photo. Another example of the characterization of offenders as the despised other is one of the offenders in the Pettit murders in Connecticut. I don't know if you remember that, but basically two men broke into the house at night. They tied up Dr. Pettit in the basement, sexually assaulted his wife, his daughters, killed his wife, and then set the home on fire, and both of his daughters died of smoke inhalation in that fire. One of the offenders, considered kind of the leader of the two, is this young man. And in the sentencing phase of this trial has been quite interesting, and how the defense has tried to personalize the offender. However, in personalizing the offender, many of the characteristics he gives him are very similar to those that we've just discussed. For example, it's emphasized that he's adopted. It's emphasized in the sentencing phase. The lawyer they quoted as saying that he was doomed from birth. He was adopted by an ultra-conservative and a ultra-religious family who are typified as believing that prayer and God would help them through any problem, even though they had a very, very problem child. This is his last name, I'm sorry. Jarefsky, I'm going to destroy that last name. But he's depicted as being raped by a foster brother that was in the care of his family. He also, as a result of that rape, sexually assaulted his own sister. He was taken for evaluation, even though his parents were unwilling to get counseling, and they refused doctors' recommendations to get their son medication or to put him in any kind of therapy. So there are many ways in which, if we see the Pettit picture, which is a normative family, a traditional family, there are many ways in which his own family, in an attempt to personalize him and to not objectify him, they portray his family as completely dysfunctional, and that his place in this family as being strange and odd, that there were precursors to his crimes. And again, I'm not saying that these things might not be actually true. It's more the way in which these instances are framed in the media. The defense attorneys even tried to show a good number of pictures of him as a young boy and to, again, personalize the offender. The judge, I thought this was interesting, suggested that the number of photos might be overkill. Not only is that inappropriate, I think, a word to use for that in a murder trial, but also in contrast to how one might display photos of the victims, both living and as a result of the crimes of the offender, I don't believe we would have a judge suggesting that we see too many photos of, well, there might be instances, but I thought it was interesting that there was resistance to seeing photos of this man as actually happy at one point and able to function relatively well. Okay, she also lastly talks about representations of police. Historically, the police have been portrayed in multiple ways. Rafter talks about this in a chapter in her book of how they've been portrayed in films. They can be bumbling idiots who solve crimes by mistake. This is kind of your Inspector Clouseau type of inspector. We also see the bumbling cops in news accounts. We were talking about the Joan Bonet case in the face-to-face course recently, and the idea that the police didn't conduct the search correctly, or they didn't follow procedure when they initially secured the home. This compromised the results of the case. So this idea that police are incompetent is a theme that tends to come out in news stories and in films. They can also be portrayed as corrupt. There's a Denzel Washington film where he's a corrupt police officer. Police corruption cases tend to get a good headline. So the corrupt police is also a theme or a particular representation. On TV in particular, we see a lot of effective, intelligent, remarkably intuitive police, but they tend to be psychologically flawed in some way. Monk is one of those. The inspector on Criminal Intent, the Vincent D'Onofrio character, was also very psychologically flawed and kind of tormented. Elliot on SVU has this temper that has to be controlled. So they tend to be on the edge of losing control sometimes. Effective, but on the edge of losing control. Sometimes their inability to, again, control their behavior and be too quick to act too violently is also a theme that we see in the characterization of police. This is true in Do the Right Thing. We're seeing some of that coverage now, I think, in the coverage of the Wall Street protests. Now, it's interesting, in the Wall Street protest case, the beginning of the coverage tends to assume that the police officer was justified in the behavior to protect the crowd, to protect other people. Recently, the coverage has shifted, I think, with the injury of the Iraq veteran, the arrest of Naomi Wolf, who's a relatively well-known feminist author. There's this idea now that the police are cracking down on protesters inappropriately. So we're seeing some of that coverage come up in the news. But again, this would be one type or one representation of police in the news: too quick to act too violently, or they overreact to simple situations. Jewkes argues, though, that in Crime Watch, police, along with the victims, are humanized. This also occurs quite frequently in these types of shows. They become those individuals in the show who guide us through the case. They tell us about the details of the case, along with the narrator of the crime story. So we begin to relate to them, and we begin to see them as the authority on the particular case. The defendant's lawyer is not the authority on the case. The police officers are the authorities on the case. I was struck by one episode of Cops that I watched that the police are often also asked to kind of reflect on their job. Sometimes they'll say things like, oh, this is just a regular night's work, or we weren't shocked by this. This does a couple things. One, it allows us to know that they're human. They're reflecting on their work, much like we reflect on our own work. Then it also perpetuates the idea that crime is common, so common and ordinary, it doesn't shock the policeman. Well, understandably, it doesn't shock the policeman. They're the police. They see crime. That's their job. That doesn't mean that crime necessarily occurs constantly for members of the public. So people in this position, if you think back to the section on children, the police were asked to kind of reflect. I've never seen this before. We're all surprised by this. We don't know why, just like the public, we don't know why this child murder might have occurred. So there's a bit of reflection on the offender, on the victims, on their job that they pursue. They're often also asked to compare this particular crime to others that they've experienced. So I remember hearing or reading in the news that a cop has been interviewed, or a police officer has been interviewed, and they've said this was the most gruesome crime scene I've ever seen. The fact that they're able to compare that with another allows us to empathize with the police, allows us to see their jobs in a particular way. And the police positions on crime in shows like Crime Watch are rarely challenged. Again, their position becomes authoritative. We see this in other forms of media as well. One example is the Baby Lisa case. If you've been following it, it's the case of I believe a 10-month-old baby that was, as far as her parents argue, was taken from the house and kidnapped. The police, according to media accounts, seem to believe that the mother might have been involved in the death of the child and is covering up the death of the child. Now, again, these are media accounts. We don't know to date what really happened. But there are several quotations that I've found that are really interesting, some headlines that I've found that are really interesting. Basically, the parents and the police have a contentious relationship over this case. According to the police, they don't believe they've had good chances to interview either the other children in the home or the parents. We've not been allowed access to the children. But they've agreed to bring them in this Friday. This is the first time we've had to interview them. We need the parents to sit apart from each other and answer the tough questions. There's a whole list of things that they might know. When you hear the counter arguments from the parents' attorneys, it turns out that actually they have been interviewed on multiple occasions. The mother took a lie detector test. She failed that test. But she did take a lie detector test. They have allowed the police into their home voluntarily. The police have been in their home with a warrant. They did speak to the children, but the parents were present at one point when they spoke with the children. The children are 8 and 5, by the way. They're really quite young. They have interviewed the parents. This request to interview the parents separately was made with the stipulation that the parents would be interviewed without a lawyer present. And that's why the parents refused to be interviewed alone with the police. So this is a complicated, confusing kind of relationship. The parents are arguing that the police are convinced that the mother committed a crime, and they're not really pursuing the case. So again, there's this contention between the police and the parents. But according to the headlines, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, we don't really hear how complicated this case is. The police's perspective tends to take authority. Baby Lisa's parents refuse son's questioning. Rift between Baby Lisa's parents' police. Parents block interviews. Are Baby Lisa's parents lying? Parents of Baby Lisa decline separate interviews. So the complexity of this relationship, or the fact that the police are putting conditions on these interviews, and that's what the disagreement is over, isn't portrayed in the headlines, and is relatively dismissed in many of these stories. And in fact, if you look up this case, it's often interesting to read the comments of the public who've read the story. Sometimes they're more telling than the story themselves, and you can see what the framing of that story is just by some of the responses and what they believe has happened in the case. This is really interesting. It applies in several chapters of this book that we've looked at. But in this case, I think it's clear that the police perspective on the cooperation of the parents has become the authoritative or the dominant representation of this case. The police have the authority to tell us how this case is moving along.